Alright guys, Wednesday the 12th, 2016. Zero hedge. So following on from my last video, I'm now going to be releasing videos which won't be particularly titled to the key points that they hit on, simply because they will be demonetized. So although this won't hit keywords in the search engines when people type certain subjects in, I will just have to rely on my subscriber base for the views, because it will then become unlikely somebody will click your video based upon a search or based upon a recommended video to watch. So I'll see how this turns out. So really, if you see videos that I upload from now on, it's probably not going to sound like an interesting title for the former reasons. But anything that I post does have a gravity of importance around all the topics that I cover, as I'm sure you're aware. And everything interlinks into each other. So although one may not be relevant to precious metals, an example, it will be relevant to the geopolitical situation, which then in turn is relevant to the precious metals price, because it will create issues in currencies. So everything is invertedly connected. So this article was submitted by Jeremiah Johnson, shtfplan.com. He is a retired Green Beret of the United States Army Special Forces. So as I read this paragraph, bellicose means demonstrating aggression and willingness to fight. So carrying on. As the US elections draw nearer, the amount of bellicose rhetoric from politicians and key military commanders, in truth, quote, politicians, end quote, as well, has been increasing. The main focus of the rhetoric has been directed towards Russia and is also blathered in the direction of China, North Korea, and Iran when it suits US political interests. The problem is all of it is not just talk. Action has to be taken, especially regarding Russia and the Syrian theatre of operations. Within the past several weeks, the US has bombed Syrian troops, killing 62 outside Deir ez-Zor in airstrikes, and in admitting to doing so, quote, mistakenly, end quote. The Russians responded by firing up a UN coalition convoy almost immediately after. Russian naval artillery then took out a command post with approximately 30, quote, coalition, end quote, officers, some of them being Americans. The US then made itself responsible, indirectly, for an attack on the Russian embassy in Damascus. Syria, anti-Assad Islamic militants did the job, and these have support with funding and materials of the US. These, quote, cat and mouse, end quote, exchanges have not been new by any means, as evidenced by the aerial, quote, Top Gun, end quote, provocative flybys that have been occurring all year long. In Syria, as well as in Eastern Europe, the US has retracted the ceasefire agreement and suspended all operations and discussions with Russia pertaining to Syria. What is new is the level that the rhetoric has reached. Rhetoric that has no longer rhetorical but actually constitutes direct threats against Russia. On September the 29th, 2016, the Washington Post reported these words from a US Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter. Quote, across the Atlantic, we're refreshing NATO's nuclear playbook to better integrate conventional and nuclear deterrence, to ensure we plan and train like we'd fight, and to deter Russia from thinking it can benefit from a nuclear use in a conflict with NATO, end quote. The irony of that statement is evident. While the US emplaces missile batteries in Germany, Romania and Moldova, Russia has not responded by placing missiles in either Cuba or Venezuela, two countries she holds strong ties with both militarily and economically. Carter champions deterrence while simultaneously works to increase US nuclear and conventional build-ups in Eastern Europe. But it doesn't stop there with his words. There was reported by George Orwallian of AFP in an article entitled US using Syrian crisis to, quote, wage a surrogate war, end quote, against Russia on October 4th, 2016. Quote, US State Department spokesman John Kirby has made strong statements regarding Russia's involvement in Syria, claiming that if Russia will not cooperate with the US, Moscow will keep sending troops home in body bags, end quote. Strong words and quite bellicose, originating with a State Department spokesman completely removed from harm's way. The date of this writing on the 5th of October, as reported by Alex Jones, Prison's Planet. Quote, I want to be clear to those who wish to do us harm. The United States military, despite all our challenges, despite our operational tempo, despite everything we have been doing, we will stop you and we will beat you harder than you have ever been beaten before. Make no mistake about that, end quote. General Mark Milley, US Army Chief of Staff. Milley was directing those words towards Russia. He went on to describe the next coming war as such. Quote, the next war will be highly lethal, unlike anything our army has experienced at least since World War II, quote, and would involve fighting in, quote, highly populated urban areas, end quote. Did the general mean overseas or in the United States? The Russians are currently, until the 7th of October, conducting nuclear evacuation drills involving over 40 million people. Everyone from Putin and his general staff to local Moscow reporters believe that a nuclear war started by the United States is just on the horizon. Just this week, Putin shelved an agreement between Russia and the US to reduce the amount of plutonium that could be converted into nuclear warheads. That agreement had been forthcoming since Obama initiated it in 2012, but Putin was straightforward in his reasoning behind cancelling those on Russia's end from Prep Blog on the 10th of the 3rd, 16. Because of US belligerence, Russia needs, quote, urgent measures to defend the security of the Russian Federation, end quote. Putin and the Russian people believe the US actions are going to lead to nuclear conflict initiated by the United States. The leadership of the US is made up of politicians who began their careers Marxist socialists, traitors, now have their fingers on the triggers of the nuclear warheads, aided by, quote, yes men, end quote, of the general staffs who will not remember their oaths to the Constitution of the United States of American people. They will ignore that these charges take precedent above any order given by a petty, dope-smoking, Marxist community organizer of dubious citizenship who was, quote, emplaced, end quote, into office to destroy the country. Instead of statesmen and diplomats, we now have self-interested, politically motivated belligerents backing Russia and other nations into corners and pushing them towards war. How long the war of words will be continued is unknown. However, when the missiles begin to fly, you can be certain of something. You can rest assured that the men who speak those words will be in bunkers and other safe places out of harm's way, paid for by the American taxpayer. So currently, guys, going on in the political stages, we have the West doing everything possible to not only brainwash the public through media outlets that Russia is being the aggressor in many scenarios, and how they are bombing Syrian troops and civilians and hospitals. And then you have the Russian sides coming out, obviously, with a counter argument and actually backing up with proof that this is all actually Western backed. So it's only those people who actually don't watch the mainstream media news channels that understand the West are doing nothing but pushing war. You can see how they are surrounding the Middle East, pushing ever closer towards the Russian borders. And that is why Russia has now been forced to defend the sovereign nations that still remain out there before the influx of even more American boots on the border of Russia, along with NATO boots. We even had Boris Johnson last night in the House of Commons discussing this topic. So let's go over and see what he said.
It's vital that we focus on what is happening in Syria, which is the question before us this afternoon. And Russia, as I say, I must say bluntly to the House that if Russia continues in its current path, then I believe that great country is in danger of becoming a pariah nation. And if President Putin's strategy is to restore the greatness and the glory of Russia, then I believe he risks seeing his ambition turn to ashes in the face of international contempt for what is happening in Syria. Russia tries to justify its onslaught in Aleppo by saying that its sole aim is to drive out Jabhat al-Nusra, or Fatah al-Sham as they now call themselves, which is the Syrian branch of al-Qaeda. No one questions that these people are terrorists. We have pledged £2.3 billion, the largest response by a donor, the second largest response apart from the United States. And I think we can be proud in our country of the help we are giving to hundreds of thousands of people. Britain has done a huge amount to mobilise, but we cannot commit to a no-fly zone unless we are prepared to confront and perhaps, as my honourable friend behind me has already said, as for New Forest, we cannot do that unless we are prepared to shoot down planes or helicopters that violate that zone. And we've got to make sure we have innovative ways of getting aid into Aleppo, and as several members have said, we have to step up the pressure on Assad's regime through sanctions, and of course on the Russians through sanctions. And this country and this government has worked to keep that flame of hope alive and to work for a settlement. And on the 7th of September, we hosted a session in London with the High Negotiations Committee of the Syrian Opposition, and they set out a detailed and progressive vision for how to achieve a transition in Syria towards a democratic, pluralist administration in which the rights of all communities in that country would be respected, but which also preserved the stability and the institutions of the Syrian state, while at the same time getting rid of the Assad regime. Yes. Well, as the right honourable lady will understand, you can't get rid of the jihadi fighters from eastern Aleppo as long as the population of Aleppo has been bombed in a ruthless aerial bombardment, which is, I'm afraid, driving people into a position in which they will do anything to fight and resist the Assad regime. Our best hope is to persuade the Russians that it is profoundly in the interests of Russia to take the initiative, to win the acclaim of the international community, do the right thing in Syria, call off their puppets in the Assad regime, stop the bombing, and bring peace to Aleppo. and to have a genuine ceasefire. And that is the way. And that is the prelude. And I'm perfectly prepared to look at Staffan de Mistura's proposals for leading out al-Nusra and all the rest of it, and perhaps to bring in a UN contingent. I think that all sounds eminently sensible. But a ceasefire and the end of the Russian bombardment has got to come first. And I hope she agrees with that.
So following on from Bojo there, this article out from RT, and again is starting to be published across the net. Aggressor Squadron. Pics of US jets painted in Russian colours spark Syria false flag conspiracy. So here we have a US Marines jet being painted Russian colours. Photos showing US jet painted Russian colours have triggered debates and the conspiracy theories online, with many saying Washington plans to conduct false flag attacks in Syria and blame them on Moscow. But why else would you be painting your jets the colour of another nation's, other than to misrepresent an attack? The pictures of the US jets were posted by a Canadian journalist last week on his Twitter account, Christian Boris. The US is painting their FA-18s to match the paint schemes of Russian jets in Syria. So there's this other article from metabunk.org, again covering this topic. So they've actually got a comparison of the two jets. This one above being the F-18 and this one below being the Su-27. Now, although the colour schemes are not identical, and although both these jets are not identical in construction appearance, you can see that they're fairly similar from an untrained eye or a wobbly pixelated camera. So the outline of the wing shapes are different, but it all comes down to what angle a camera would be filming upon. Because if you had this image here with a bit of a blurry camera at range, I think you could quite easily mistake the jet for being a Russian Su-27, when in fact it might be an Fa-18 that just bombs a US military base in Syria or a routine patrol of United States troops or NATO troops, which would be the catalyst to an all-out aggression from the West. And this is why you've got people on the West pushing this aggressive stance of Russia. Because although Russia will not bomb or attack any Western forces, because they know the second they do it, they're in for war. Now, they're not afraid of the war, but they're not interested in war. They'd rather just get back to business with building infrastructures, businesses, and focusing on networking with the Asian nations and the Middle Eastern nations and creating a prosperous future. But as we know in the West, we have a huge pending financial situation. And we all know the only way that that can be smokescreened is if there's a war. If you have a pending financial crisis, which is becoming more and more difficult to sustain and fool people into thinking we're in a recovery, when everybody knows full well we're not in a recovery. You can't be recovering and still unable to pay the trillions in debt that's been accrued during the previous 2 decades. The exponential increase in debt, which has also been spent on other wars in destroying the Middle East, spent in overthrowing other governments, not only in Asia and the Middle East, but also Africa, Brazil, Venezuela. And then you got idiots like Boris Johnson, who has no concept, I think, of what he's even talking about. Because I was watching the debate in the House, and in the House of Commons, and I was just thinking, I wonder how much these guys actually believe what it is that they're saying. Maybe they are so brainwashed as well. Maybe they are only reading one form of information, because when you're in the spotlight and having to deal with these sort of issues, I actually am starting to think that they are only fed information from the military forces or higher people in position in governments. Do they really know and have the time to delve into other aspects? Well, one, no, because they're only interested in their own personal gain. They're only interested in the agenda. And they don't even care if what they're doing is wrong, immorally, or they're just as much a puppet as the brainwashed citizen. So it goes without saying, anything that comes out of these people's mouths is bullshit. So let's see what the Russian government is saying to its people. Again, 11th of October. Russian government officials told to immediately bring back children studying abroad. In Europe, when it gets serious, you have to lie. At least if you are an unelected bureaucrat like Jean-Claude Juncker. In Russia, however, when it gets serious, attention immediately turns to the children. Which is why we read a report in Russian website Znak, published Tuesday, according to which Russian state officials and government workers were told to bring back their children studying abroad immediately, even if it means cutting their education short of not waiting until the end of the school year, and re-enroll them in Russian schools. With some concern, the article adds that if the parents of these same officials also live abroad, quote, for some reason, end quote, and have not lost their Russian citizenship, should also be returned to the motherland. Znak cited 5 administration officials as the source of the report. The quote recommendation, end quote, applies to all, from the administration staff to regional administrators, to lawmakers of all levels. Employees of public corporations are also subject to the ordinance. One of the sources said that anyone who fails to act will find such non-compliance to be a, quote, complicating factor in the furtherance of their public sector career, end quote. He added that he was aware of several such cases in recent months. It appears that the underlying reason behind the command is that the Russian government is concerned about the optics of having children of the Russian political elite being educated abroad, while their parents appear on television talking about patriotism and being, quote, surrounded by enemies, end quote. While we doubt the impacted children will be happy about this development, some of the more problematic local, if unimpacted, are delighted, such as Vitaly Ivanov, a political scientist who believes that the measure to return children of officials from studying abroad is, quote, long overdue, end quote. According to Ivanov, the education of children of the Russian elite abroad is subject to constant ridicule and derision against the ruling regime. Quote, people, not the hypocrisy of having a centralized state and cultivating patriotism and anti-Western sentiment while children of government workers study abroad. We cannot serve 2 gods. One must choose. End quote. On the other hand, political analyst Stanislav Belkovsky, quoted by Znak, believes that such decisions should be appropriate with more pragmatism. Such a recommendation is more likely to lead to an outflow of officials from the state rather than allow the return of their children studying at elite foreign universities. He also warned of attempts to recreate an echo chamber such as that experienced after the failed July coup attempt by Turkey's President Erdogan. But what he said next was more disturbing. Quote, on the one hand, this is all part of a package of measures to prepare the elites for some big war, even if it is rather conditional. On the other hand, This is another blow to the unity of President Putin with his own elite, end quote. Belkovsky said, he adds that the Western sanctions launched in March 2014 had sought to dive a wedge between Putin and elites. In response, the Kremlin began to act precisely according to the logic of these sanctions. Quote, but while a ban for having assets in the West is one thing, and understandable, when it comes to a ban for offshore health and education services, the blowback will be far greater, as it represents a far more important element of the establishment's life strategy, end quote. Ultimately, the motivation behind Putin's decision is unclear, whether it is to show Russia's high-ranking oligarchs who is boss, to boost a sense of patriotism among the nation by sending a symbolic message that the West is no longer a welcome destination for Russia's rich kids, or just a preemptive move of repatriating of any individuals affiliated with Russian politics for other unknown reasons. However, it underscores the severity of the ongoing diplomatic crisis and just how significant the upcoming isolation between Russia and the West is likely to become in the coming months, unless, of course, tensions de-escalate dramatically, in which very near future, resulting in even greater collapse in global commerce and a further slowdown to the world economic growth, which may ultimately lead to an armed conflict, whether regional or global, as the only possible outcome. So guys, if you're following what is actually going on with Russia and the West and China, then you will understand Putin is a very, very smart guy, not retaliating in the normal ways people would, not being outspoken in the ways that people normally would. He's a very cool, calm, collected guy, and he is a master of the chessboard. The West have been trying for decades to take down Russia. Putin is a new breed that the Western globalists can't defeat. And I believe this is Putin making a preemptive strike in withdrawing potential loose leads that could bring leaked information or blackmailing or severe repercussions for Russia should these so-called elite children be kidnapped and held for ransom, whether it be politically motivated, whether it be in order to blackmail the children's parents into doing what the psychopathic globalists demand of that person inside of the Putin establishment. So this is where it becomes very internally dangerous, and dangerous for Putin. And he can see this ahead of time because he's a master tactician. So he is trying to eliminate the threat of his governmental officials being bribed and blackmailed into either revealing top secret information in order for the safe passage of their child back to Russia, which any parent would do. So this is really, yet again, Putin showing the world how he just sidesteps anything that the Western throw at him, that the Western globalists throw at him. He's always a few moves ahead, and that is why he was not taken out in the car. He knows what's happening. He sees what's happening. And don't forget, guys, he was a member of the KGB. He was in the front line carrying out top secret intel gatherings, dealing with people face to face. He's not a globalist elite who has never had to do anything for himself, has never had to work for money, is not part of a cross-inbreed MK Ultra class of globalists. And when your DNA is spread through generations and generations internally through the Bush families, the Clinton families, the Rockefeller families, that shit plays with your brain and retards you, turns you into a psychopathic inbred. Anyway, guys, that's an update as to what's happening with the West versus East scenario. I'll see what else is going on and update you shortly. Thanks for watching.